This is the Tiger I, by far the most famous vehicle we have in our collection and the German tank per se. The Tiger was fielded for the first time in the summer of 1942 in small numbers and then from the summer of 1943 onwards in large numbers. He's often described as a reaction of the Wehrmacht to the Soviet tanks they encountered from 1941 onwards. And that is true in a sense, because the encounter of the Red Army brought the Tiger into reality, but its roots are far older. The Tiger of the Second World War is actually a child of the 1930s. In this decade, several companies worked on designs for so-called 30-Tonner, tanks roughly in the class of 30 tons. These were considered heavy for the time. Daimler-Benz, MAN, Henschel and several other companies worked on these designs. And the actual ancestor of the Tiger stems from these designs, the DURCHBRUCHWAGEN 1, the breakthrough vehicle number 1. And the name shows how clearly the designs were influenced by concepts of war from the First World War. The designers wanted a vehicle that was able to break through a line by sheer mass, armor and power. So the ancestor of the Tiger was firmly rooted in concepts of trench warfare. The Durchbruchwagen was so big that it had to be delivered in 2 parts to the front and assembled at the front line because they weren't able to build armor plates big enough for this concept. And all the follow-up designs had the same characteristics, the Durchbruchwagen 2, the VK 3001. Looking at these designs, one can see the Tiger emerge slowly over time. They all are big, massive, bulky, and the form stays rather the same over all design. All the time one can see what is called the classical German tank configuration. We have the hull at the base, topped by the so-called Panzerkasten, the armored box. And on top of that, the turret. This is the reason why the Tiger looks rather old-fashioned, although it reached the battlefield not before 1943. The studies of the 1930s culminated in the VK 6501, which was supposed to reach 65 tons. This vehicle was supposed to be delivered to the front lines even in 3 parts per train. That was a concept that the Germans had already developed in the First World War for the so-called K-Wagen. So the concepts are not roughly or somewhat the same like in the First World War, they are exactly the same. And all these designs end up in the Tiger you can see here. Made of one piece, but with 56 tons, still very heavy. So because of these older roots and traditions, the Tiger is a far more conservative and old-fashioned design than, for example, its 1943 twin, the Panther. But then again, it also should not be forgotten that the Tiger fielded high-tech solutions for specific problems inside. There is hardly a vehicle that polarizes as much as the Tiger does. On the one hand, there are legions of fans who adore the Tiger as the pinnacle of tank engineering and military history. On the other hand, there are nearly as much harsh critics who say the system was too complex, too expensive, and the money would have been better spent on normal tanks. It is most interesting that this is not a modern phenomenon. The discussion already started before the Tiger rolled out of the factory gates. To illustrate this point, I will now read a quote from the leading engineer of the Tiger, Ingenieur Erwin Aders. He said after the war, quote, "Even in September or October 1942, the Tiger-Ausführung E was still called a sluggish cart by decisive authorities, and the cylindrical turret, which was designed after careful deliberation by Krupp, was compared with a tin can. The reason for that was a premature and wrong first deployment." After a few months, to the surprise of all those involved, a glorification of the Tiger started in the press, with exaggerations that were as unpleasant for us as the earlier scorn. The adulation of the Tiger was not without consequences. Even experienced officers and non-commissioned officers fell for the propaganda picture of the Tiger as a Wunderwaffe, and therefore expected impossible things from the Tigers and their crews. They assigned missions to the Tigers that were simply not feasible, because they honestly believed the Tiger could do almost anything. Therefore, several orders and memorandums from the higher levels of the Wehrmacht can be found in the archives that explicitly say, look, the Tiger is anything but invulnerable. There was, for example, one paper of the tank officer of the Chief of Staff of the German Army, in which he is clearly agitated and angry that there are after-action reports in which the soldiers from the front lines are confused that Tigers are actually destroyed. And he then unmistakably states that Tigers are not indestructible. And to drive the point home, he actually adds a list of Soviet cannons which states over which distance they can penetrate the Tiger's armor. So it's crucial for him to make clear that the Tigers have to be used properly. However, these serious discussions of the people who actually used the Tiger about how it should be used and how it should not be used should remind us that all the discussions about the greatness or the dumbness of the tiger may be fun and games today, but was a question of life and death at the time the tiger was used. So if we discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the tiger, we shan't trivialize it. Practically all of the 1,350 tigers were destroyed. Only 7 tigers survive in collections worldwide. And this raises the question, if the tiger was this heavily armored Wunderwaffe, how come they all were destroyed? And oftentimes you hear the answer, well, to knock out a tiger, you absolutely needed air support, close air support, fighter bombers. At least for the Western Front, this is the standard story. And it's absolutely plausible because the memory of the Western Front is dominated by the crushing air superiority of the Western Allies. Well, a closer look at the statistic tells us that this is not the whole story. Actually, the story is rather normal and ground-centered. From June to August 1944, for example, 131 tigers were counted as total losses. Of these, 60 were taken out by direct or indirect fire. So they got hit like this, by tanks, anti-tank guns or artillery. 58 tigers were given up and or self-destroyed. Only 13 tigers were taken out by air attacks, so roughly only 10%. This fits nicely with the findings of a British report in which 110 German destroyed tanks were analyzed. And again, roughly 70% were taken out by direct or indirect fire, and only 10% were taken out by air attacks. 11 were self-destroyed, the rest is unclear. The central point is that the ratio is roughly the same. The lion's share is taken out by ground attacks, only the smallest part is taken out by air attacks. It is interesting that the percentage of tigers that got destroyed by direct or indirect fire is lower than the percentage of tanks of all types in the comparison group. The thick armor seems to have worked. But we also see that the percentage of tigers that had to be given up or were self-destroyed is also significantly higher. So this raises the question, why was that? Apart from adoration, the tiger also drew harsh criticism over the years. We now want to look at 3 typical critiques regarding the tiger. One common argument is that the tiger was far too complicated. The maintenance was very complicated, it broke down too often and it was hard to repair, so the argument goes. This is the reason why we are looking at the SCHACHTELLAUFWERK right now. It's often cited as a typical over-engineered solution. The only hard data you can look at to determine if this argument is sound or not is a comparison of the action readiness percentages of the tiger in comparison with the Panther or the Panzer IV, the tanks which rolled alongside the tiger onto the battlefield. And the tiger's numbers are not significantly worse. The Panzer IV, for example, had readiness percentages of 68 to 71% regarding the Eastern and the Western Front. The Panther was at 62 and 65%. The tiger's numbers were 65% and 70%. Squarely in the middle field. So it was absolutely possible to achieve the same combat readiness as the Panzer IV and the Panther. It has to be said though that a little more work was needed to reach this level. Another common argument is that with 56 tons the tiger was simply too heavy to be mobile on the battlefield. But the image of the cumbersome, immobile tiger is also wrong. First of all, the contemporary sources don't even hint in this direction, and secondly, the running tiger in Tank Museum Bovington wonderfully proves that the tiger is not cumbersome at all. Additionally, the technical data of the tiger again places him with his peers. Acceleration, top speed, turning cycle, nothing hints for an especially cumbersome or sluggish vehicle. This actually was the reason why the tiger was so complicated to build and so expensive to reach these data with this weight. So while it seems plausible that a heavy vehicle must be cumbersome, it's simply not the case. Strictly speaking, the driver of a tiger had a rather easy job, at least physically, because the driving was complicated, but once the driver had mastered the system, he had a rather comfortable workplace. Once again, the perks of the lavish spending of money. The third problem was a real one though, although it's often forgotten, and that was recovery. If a 56-ton vehicle got stuck on the ground, you had a real problem. You either needed specialized heavy salvage equipment, which was often not available, or you had to improvise and combine 5, 6, 7 vehicles together to pull the tiger out of the mud. The latter approach was far more often the case. It could work, but it was complicated and it took time, and this explains the numbers of the last chapter. Once a tiger was stuck for whatever reason, it was far more complicated and often impossible to retrieve the vehicle. Therefore, the tigers had far more often to be given up than their lighter cousins. This is especially significant during operational defense, which was exactly the scenario of the Wehrmacht in France 1944. So this combination explains why the percentage of given-up tigers and self-destroyed tigers is far higher than these of their lighter cousins.